Hey there, survivors. Thanks for tuning into this story. If you're new here, please consider subscribing. It really helps me keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now let's get started. I never pictured myself leaving my grandfather's cabin once I settled there in the wake of the zombie outbreak. But as the days bled into weeks and the final sirens died away, Brent and I came to a sobering realization. Hiding in that isolated sanctuary could only prolong the inevitable. We'd managed to fend off small threats, occasional infected figures skulking near the perimeter, but signs of larger dangers were everywhere. Footprints, unsettling animal cries, the lingering fear that our defenses wouldn't hold forever. One day, while searching through old emergency kits and sifting through scraps of static-filled radio broadcasts, we found clues suggesting a possible refuge somewhere in the far north, coordinates mentioned in passing, rumors that quarantine zones might still operate up there. It wasn't much, but in a world without solid information, even a single mention of hope was enough. With no more official bulletins to guide us, we had to chart our own course. And so, when these faint whispers of a safer region reached us, regardless of how uncertain or incomplete they were, we felt we had little choice but to try. This is how I found myself on a chilly morning, standing on the porch I'd once regarded as my safe haven, gazing out at the pine forest that had become a place of nightmares. Brent was beside me, quietly checking his backpack's straps, his face lined with the same tension I felt in my own heart. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice hushed as though the trees might be listening. "Not in the slightest," I replied, "but I'd rather take a chance now than wait here for whatever's coming." We didn't speak of it directly, but we both knew more infected were out there. Over the last few nights, something had been testing our barricades, scratching at the wood, leaving half-moon marks on the window frames. We'd used what little ammo we had to scare them off, but the ominous sense that we were targets lingered. And so we made the decision to pack our most vital supplies: canned goods, dried meat, a few canteens, first aid supplies, a battery-powered radio that had long been silent, and all the ammunition we could carry. For a moment, I paused in the cabin's doorway. This place had once felt like everything I ever needed: a life free from society's noise, a refuge among towering pines. Now, it felt like a relic of a world gone by. "Goodbye," I whispered, unsure if I was speaking to the cabin itself or the memory of simpler days. Then I stepped onto the rough path with Brent, the hush of the forest closing in around us. Our plan was straightforward enough on paper. We'd navigate the old logging roads heading north, avoiding main highways where we suspected the worst of the infected might roam. I knew these forest trails reasonably well, having hunted in them for years. But with the infection possibly infiltrating local wildlife, that knowledge became less of an advantage and more a grim reminder of what might now lurk in once familiar woods. The morning air was crisp, with a faint haze of mist clinging to the undergrowth. We moved quietly, stepping around twigs and leaf piles, both hyper-alert to every bird call and rustle. Brent, walking slightly behind me, gripped his rifle tight. Neither of us spoke much. Even low conversation felt risky, as if we'd betray our presence to unseen watchers. After a couple of hours, the forest opened into a clearing, where an old lumber company had once operated. Rusted equipment lay scattered among tall grasses. I remembered passing it countless times, but never had it looked so eerie, silent, overgrown, blanketed by an uneasy calm. "I don't like this," Brent said quietly. I nodded. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. It felt as though the space itself was watching us. We debated skirting the clearing entirely, but that would have meant hiking deeper into dense forest we didn't know as well. So we pressed on, picking our way through rust-eaten machinery, stepping over broken pallets that had decayed under the elements. Halfway across, I nearly jumped out of my skin when something clanged against metal to our left. Brent dropped into a crouch, rifle raised. My heart thudded so loudly I thought it would give us away. But nothing moved in the open. We waited a long, tense moment, scanning each piece of debris. Then we heard a faint scuttling, a squirrel or a raccoon perhaps, darting between the leftover scraps. I exhaled, relieved, yet still unsettled. Once we were clear of the clearing, the logging roads continued, winding through tall stands of pine and spruce. The hush returned, broken only by our breathing and the distant caw of crows. We marched onward, forging deeper into territory where few ventured even before the outbreak. Around midday, we stopped near a trickling stream to refill our canteens. It was a risk, no telling what might lurk nearby, but we had no choice if we wanted clean water. Brent kept watch while I filtered water through a simple setup I'd used for years. The forest canopy above us swayed gently in the breeze, letting flecks of sunlight pass through. I handed Brent a canteen. He nodded his thanks, took a long drink, then pointed to a nearby birch trunk. "Look," he whispered. Carved into the bark were fresh symbols, some sort of makeshift sign, a crude arrow pointing north, next to two letters I didn't recognize. I ran my fingers over them. The cuts were smooth, not more than a day old. Someone had been through here recently, marking the way. "Could be survivors," Brent said softly. "Or a trap," I replied. Still, we were heading north ourselves, and if these people were leaving a trail, maybe they knew more about safe routes. We decided to follow the arrow but proceed carefully, maintaining as much cover as possible. A few miles later, we encountered the remains of a man-made barricade strung across the logging road. Stacked logs, sheets of corrugated metal, and a broken truck lying on its side. It looked hastily assembled, then violently torn apart. I couldn't tell if infected individuals or animals had broken through, but signs of struggle were all around. Splintered wood, deep scratches in the metal. We examined the truck. The windows were shattered, the interior gutted. One seat had dark stains. My stomach knotted. We forced ourselves to keep moving, slipping around the barricade's edge. As we crept past the mangled truck, we spotted what might have been bullet holes peppering the metal. Someone had made a stand here, and it hadn't ended well. An uneasy silence settled over us. Was this the fate of everyone who'd tried to flee north? Or had some people survived and continued on foot? Brent pressed a hand to my shoulder. "We should move quickly." I agreed, and we continued with renewed urgency, a cold tension growing in my chest. Late that afternoon, the trees thinned enough for us to glimpse a range of hills rolling off into the distance. Under normal circumstances, it would have been a stunning view, but we only paused to gauge how much farther we needed to go before looking for shelter for the night. "We can't risk being out in the open after dark," I said, recalling how shadows used to creep around my cabin. Brent scanned the horizon. "There might be a ranger station a few more miles up. My uncle used to do volunteer work in these woods. He mentioned a small outpost near the base of that big hill. If it's still intact, we could try to hole up there for the night." That was the best lead we had. Pushing ourselves hard, we navigated the undulating terrain, mindful of every snapped twig, every stray movement. The infection had taught us that even a moment of lost focus could be lethal. As dusk fell, we finally saw a weathered sign reading, "Ranger Station, 1 mile," an arrow pointing east. Our spirits lifted slightly. Civilization, even in a small form, meant possible shelter or resources. By the time we reached it, dusk had melted into a velvety twilight. The building was a one-story wooden structure with a battered roof, surrounded by a chain-link fence topped by barbed wire. It looked as though someone had attempted to reinforce it. There were boards over the windows, a padlocked gate at the entrance, and faint scuff marks indicating some kind of altercation. My pulse quickened. Brent and I exchanged a glance, then approached quietly. We saw no movement inside, but that didn't mean the place was empty. "Hello?" I called softly through the fence. "Anyone there?" No answer. We tried rattling the gate, but it was locked tight. Upon closer inspection, the lock looked damaged. Dents and scratches covered its surface. "Stand back," I whispered, removing a crowbar from my pack. With a few careful pulls, the lock snapped. The gate creaked open. Inside the fence, tall weeds and scattered debris littered the courtyard. The station's front door was also boarded up, but not thoroughly. We eased one plank aside, hearts pounding, and stepped inside with flashlights. The interior smelled of musty wood and stale air. The main reception area had a few desks and chairs overturned, flyers and papers scattered everywhere. We found two small side rooms, one filled with old maps, the other apparently a storage closet with half-empty shelves of supplies. Brent found a metal cabinet in the closet. The door was ajar. Inside were a couple of flashlights, spare batteries, though many were corroded, a small toolkit, and an old first aid kit. I rummaged through the scattered items, discovering a few packages of dehydrated meals. My spirits lifted. In the apocalypse, such finds were gold. We carefully checked every corner of the station. It seemed nobody else was there. But we did notice signs that someone had lived here recently. A pile of folded blankets in a corner, a half-burnt candle, and footprints in the dust. I wondered if they'd left or been forced out. With no immediate danger apparent, we barricaded the door again and set up a temporary campsite in the main room. As darkness settled outside, we could hear the forest's night chorus, insects, distant rustling, an occasional owl. Yet behind it all, a subtle tension lingered, like a single chord of dissonance in a melody. Sometime in the dead of night, I jolted awake to a muffled thump against the side of the station. My heart kicked into overdrive. I nudged Brent. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, scanning the dark room with my flashlight. He rubbed his eyes, nodding. Another thump echoed, closer. We scrambled to our feet, grabbing our rifles. With our backs against the wall, we stayed silent, ears strained to catch any hint of what was outside. The station's windows were boarded, but thin slivers of moonlight shone through the cracks. Then, in the hush, we heard a low moan or growl, an uncertain sound, neither fully human nor purely animal. A second later, a loud scratch raked across the wooden boards outside. My pulse pounded. It was reminiscent of the nights in the cabin, when unknown infected roamers tested the walls. Yet this time, we were in a building we scarcely knew, unsure how well it had been fortified. The scraping sound moved along the exterior, as though circling the building. Brent and I crept to the far corner where we'd set up our bedding, hoping to stay out of sight. The air felt charged, and every breath I took was carefully measured to avoid making noise. Minutes dragged on. Twice the boards rattled, but whatever was out there never forced its way inside. Eventually the moaning and scratching receded into the distance, leaving us tense and sweating in the silent darkness. We didn't sleep after that. At first light, we took stock of the situation. Brent looked drained, dark circles under his eyes. My own nerves were frayed. "We can't stay here long," I said, packing up supplies. "That thing might return with friends." Brent, rummaging in the storage closet, uncovered an old topographic map. He spread it across a desk. "If we keep heading north along the main slope, we'll reach a higher ridge. After that, it's mostly descending terrain for a while. On the other side of that ridge are rumors of farmland or small communities. Maybe they're in better shape." I peered at the map. My knowledge of these areas was superficial. My hunting grounds mostly stayed south of that ridge. But farmland meant an open landscape, which could be a blessing or a curse. Infected animals or infected humans would have fewer places to hide, but we'd also be easier to spot at a distance. Still, pressing north seemed our best option. Before leaving, we gathered what was useful from the station. Extra batteries, the dehydrated meals, a battered hatchet, and as many relevant map sections as we could find. We were about to step outside when we spotted something unusual pinned behind the front desk, an emergency radio frequency list. Most were likely defunct, but we took a photo of it on my phone just in case. Even though cell towers were down, the device could still snap pictures. Leaving the station felt like stepping into a tense standoff with nature. The early morning air was cold enough to see our breath, and the forest around us seemed watchful, as if it knew we were there. The chain-link fence rattled in a faint breeze. With one final glance at the building that had sheltered us for a night, we started up the slope. carefully picking our way through undergrowth. The hike was grueling. Without well-maintained trails, we scrambled over rocks, maneuvered around fallen logs, and occasionally had to double back to avoid sheer drop-offs. The crisp mountain air bit at our faces, and the backpacks felt heavier with each step. Despite the hard climb, the vantage points were invaluable. From open ledges, we could see miles of rolling forest behind us, the station no more than a speck. Once or twice, we paused, scanning the distance for any sign of movement. A few times we spotted deer, but they darted away so quickly we never got a clear look at whether they were normal or infected. A pair of ravens kept circling overhead, letting out sharp cries. By midday, we were nearing the crest of the ridge, breath ragged, legs aching. The trail we improvised switchbacked along a rocky face. At one point, Brent slipped on loose gravel. I lunged, grabbing his arm to keep him from tumbling down the slope. "Thanks," he muttered, voice shaking. "Just watch your footing. We can't afford a broken leg out here." Pressing on, we finally reached the summit in the late afternoon. The wind cut sharply, but the view was breathtaking. An expansive valley spread below us, dotted with patches of farmland, winding roads, and clusters of what looked like small buildings. My heart leapt. A chance at refuge. Brent pointed. "That must be where we're heading." "Let's get a closer look," I said, fishing out the small binoculars I'd tucked away. Through the lenses, I could make out a couple of farmhouses, barns, fenced fields. My hope grew, but then I noticed something chilling. One of the barns had collapsed, and near it, dark forms dotted the fields. I couldn't tell if they were people, animals, or something else. I passed the binoculars to Brent, who confirmed my suspicion. "I see. Movement, but it's not clear what they are." Still, farmland could mean food stores, maybe vehicles, and possibly survivors. We decided we'd descend carefully, making camp in the foothills if needed, then approach the farms at first light. Going downhill was faster, though no less perilous. We kept scanning the valley, looking for roads or signs of large infected groups. As dusk settled, we found a rocky overhang that offered partial shelter. We cleared away debris and set up a small, contained fire using dry branches. The night was calmer than the last, no immediate scrapes against our makeshift camp, no eerie moans drifting on the breeze. But the forest's silence carried its own menace. Even normal nighttime creatures, owls, foxes, raccoons, seemed scarce. Despite our fatigue, we split the watch, each staying alert for a few hours. I found myself reflecting on how drastically my life had changed in such a short time. Not long ago, I had stood on my cabin porch, listening to the last emergency broadcasts. Now, I was perched in a cold, stony hollow in a remote mountain region, clinging to the faint hope that farmland might offer answers, or, at the very least, some measure of security. In the small hours, the wind swept through the pines, producing a lonely, whistling sound. I noticed Brent had dozed off, head bobbing against his chest. I gently shook him awake. "Your turn," I murmured. He rubbed his eyes. "Right, sorry." I drifted into a restless sleep, haunted by half-formed dreams of searching empty barns, only to find them filled with silent watchers. Morning broke with a pale sun struggling against a bank of grey clouds. We packed up camp, ate a quick meal of dried fruit and jerky, and descended the remaining stretch of the ridge. The farmland at the valley floor appeared quiet from a distance. No vehicles or signs of normal life. Eventually, we reached the edge of a wire fence, presumably the boundary of one of the properties we'd spotted. Grass grew in thick clusters around it, and the gate looked like it hadn't been opened in some time. Beyond that fence stood a farmhouse with peeling paint, the windows dark. A barn lay a couple 100 yards past that, partially collapsed. We moved cautiously, rifles at the ready. The silence pressed down on us, broken only by the wind rustling the tall grass. The front door of the farmhouse was ajar, creaking softly on its hinges. Something about that open door felt like an invitation or a trap. I couldn't decide which. Brent nodded toward the side of the house. We circled around, peering through a small window. Inside, the furniture was overturned, and scattered clothing littered the floor. I saw no immediate movement. We tried calling out softly, "Hello, anyone there?" Our voices echoed in the empty space. No response. Finally, we mustered our courage and slipped inside, stepping over broken glass. The interior told a grim story. Signs of a struggle, a dried spill across the kitchen tiles, and bullet holes in one wall. Dust motes danced in the stale air. The living room looked as though someone had barricaded it at one point. Furniture shoved against windows, boards hammered across the doorway. But the boards were splintered, as if forced from the outside. I forced my breathing to remain even. Brent checked a side room, a small office, while I looked through the kitchen. On a countertop, I found a stack of old newspapers. One headline read, "Infection reaches new counties. Governor declares state of emergency." Another was soaked with what looked like water damage, the words blurred. From the office, Brent called in a low voice, "You need to see this." I joined him. He'd discovered a pinned-up map on the wall with several circles drawn. One was labeled with an uncertain scrawl, "Quarantine Camp." Another read, "Roadblock." A third circle, farther north, bore a note, "Military." Next to the map lay a small notebook. Pages were covered in frantic handwriting, descriptions of infected animals, rumors of rescue convoys that never arrived, and a final entry that read, "Going north to find the camp. No choice. If you find this, do the same. This place isn't safe." We exchanged glances. Did these folks make it, or were they among the missing? At least it confirmed rumors of a possible quarantine camp further north. Our battered spirits rose a fraction. Brent carefully folded the map and stuffed it in his pack. We tried the pantry, discovering it had been thoroughly cleaned out. The only edible items were a couple of stale cereal bars, which we pocketed. Not much, but better than nothing. After ensuring the house was clear of threats, we considered checking the barn, though it looked unsafe. Despite the risk, curiosity and desperation pushed us to investigate. We circled the barn's exterior, noticing multiple breaches where the walls had caved. Sunlight streamed through large gaps in the roof. The closer we got, the stronger a pungent odor grew, decay perhaps. Inside, the dirt floor was scattered with old farming equipment, bales of hay, and a few broken animal stalls. In one corner, we found a pile of empty feed bags and overturned crates. With each step, the floor groaned, prompting us to tread carefully. Suddenly, Brent gasped, raising his hand. I followed his gaze to a small side pen, a horse, lying unnaturally still. Its fur looked patchy, and the body was partially covered in flies. My stomach tightened as I realized this might confirm that the infection had indeed jumped to larger animals. We ventured closer. Though we tried to remain calm, dread seeped into our thoughts. The horse's limbs were stiff, muzzle contorted, yet there were no obvious injuries aside from minor scrapes. For a moment I considered the possibility of disease or infection. If it had turned aggressive like the warnings suggested, maybe someone or something had to put it down. We backed away, hearts heavy. Whatever had happened here, we wouldn't find any live livestock. The barn offered no salvageable supplies, and only more evidence of how far the infection had spread. "Let's move on," Brent murmured. We left the barn, crossing the property until we reached another fence line. Beyond that fence, the land sloped into a shallow valley studded with trees. Somewhere on the other side might be the quarantine camp, circled on the farmhouse map. The next couple of days were a grim mixture of searching for supplies and avoiding potential threats. We passed more farms, all in similarly dire states, boarded-up windows, broken gates, signs of frantic evacuation. At one place we spotted a silo with large letters painted on it, "Help us," faded and peeling. That was the only clue of inhabitants, but we never found anyone inside. Every so often we heard distant growls or moans at night, but we managed to slip by undetected. The farmland's openness felt simultaneously freeing and terrifying. with little cover if we encountered a large group of infected. Twice, we saw shapes prowling the edges of fields at night. Once I glimpsed what looked like a pack of coyotes or feral dogs, their eyes glinting in the moonlight as they paused to watch us from afar. Though we tried scanning for signs of a camp or gathering, we found no official outpost, no functioning government stations, no soldiers handing out supplies. Just empty roads and scattered vehicles left to rust. Yet the circled map note, "Quarantine Camp," lingered in our minds. Each morning we pressed further north, hoping this rumored sanctuary would reveal itself. On the fourth day in the valley, as we skirted a grove of poplar trees, we heard the distinctive hum of an engine. Brent and I locked eyes, hearts leaping. Neither of us had seen or heard any operating vehicle since leaving the cabin. We ducked behind a hedge, scanning the horizon. Sure enough, a dusty pickup truck rumbled slowly down a distant dirt road. It moved erratically, as if the driver wasn't entirely in control or was wary of the terrain. "Survivors," Brent breathed, excitement flashing across his features. But we couldn't be sure if they were friendly. We weighed the risks of approaching. In the end, we agreed to attempt contact, cautiously. If they were hostile or infected, we'd have to retreat. We jogged along a parallel line of trees, staying hidden, until we were close enough to flag them down without being in immediate harm's way. Brent called out, waving an arm. The truck braked sharply. A moment later, the door swung open and a figure hopped out, an older man with a ragged beard, wearing a worn jacket. He aimed a hunting rifle in our direction, voice cracking as he shouted, "Stop right there!" We raised our hands, trying to appear non-threatening. "We're not infected," I said loudly. "We're just looking for safe passage north." The man eyed us for a tense moment, then slowly lowered his weapon. "Anyone else with you?" We shook our heads. He motioned us closer, though his posture remained tense. He introduced himself as Ward, a former farmhand who'd been driving back roads, searching for any sign of family or a rumored relief station. The infection had destroyed his community weeks ago. Ward was cautious, but seemed genuinely relieved to meet fellow survivors. We exchanged stories in hurried whispers. When we mentioned the map note about a possible quarantine camp, Ward shook his head. "Heard the same rumor. If it was ever real, it's probably gone now. I haven't seen anything but empty towns and infected prowlers." Still, he offered us a ride, at least until his truck ran out of fuel. "Better than walking," he said with a wry shrug. "More dangerous in some ways, but if we stick to minor roads, we might avoid the worst." We hesitated only briefly. Our feet were sore, supplies running low. Any chance to cover ground faster felt worth the risk. Climbing into the dusty cab, I couldn't help but recall how not long ago I'd refused to trust anyone, but circumstances changed, and we needed each other now. With Ward's truck rattling along narrow dirt paths, we made progress north in ways that would have taken us days on foot. The farmland gave way to rolling meadows and sparse woodlots. Occasionally, we'd spot small clusters of abandoned houses, but Ward was reluctant to stop unless absolutely necessary. "The more you poke around empty homes," he reasoned, "the more likely you'll run into trouble." He had a point. So far, his strategy of quick travel and minimal contact seemed to work. We saw only a few scattered infected figures, easily avoided by detouring around them in the truck. Once, an infected dog bounded after us, snarling, but it quickly fell behind. Over time, tension in the truck eased. We even allowed ourselves a small laugh when Ward recounted how he managed to siphon gas from a fancy car at a golf club, while a startled deer hopped across the fairway. Even in the apocalypse, absurd moments persisted. Still, we never truly let our guard down. Every half hour or so, Brent or I would scan the road behind us, checking for any sign of pursuit. On the second day in Ward's truck, we tried the radio again. An old handheld set I carried from the cabin. Most channels were dead air or static. Then, near dusk, we picked up a faint signal. The voice crackled, nearly inaudible, but a few words were clear. "If anyone can hear this, north, latitude, quarantine." We all leaned forward, hearts pounding. Ward fiddled with the dial, searching for clarity. The voice drifted in and out, never quite forming a full sentence. But the repeated mention of quarantine and north sent our hopes soaring. "Could be the place we're looking for," Brent murmured. "Could be an old recording," Ward cautioned. Either way, it meant there was some form of broadcast out there. We decided to keep scanning that frequency, hoping for another update. Close to nightfall, we spotted an old highway checkpoint in the distance, likely established during the early days of the quarantine. Concrete barriers, cones, and a small guard post stood crooked along the road. Ward slowed the truck. We debated stopping. The area could hold useful supplies or documents, maybe even a working radio tower. But it also screamed danger. Checkpoints often became flashpoints for infected surges or worse, human desperation. In the end, we settled on a brief reconnaissance. Ward parked the truck behind a cluster of bushes, engine off to mask our presence. Brent and I approached on foot, rifles ready. The evening light cast long shadows across the battered asphalt. Sure enough, the checkpoint had the look of a place overrun. Vehicles were abandoned, some with smashed windows. A military transport truck sat skewed across the lane, its rear door open, crates strewn about. Empty bullet casings glinted in the fading sun. As we inched closer, we noticed a small, portable building, likely used by guards. Its door had been torn off. Inside, desks were knocked over, and scattered forms lay everywhere. I picked one up. It was an intake form for potentially infected individuals. The rest were blank or half-filled. At the corner of the small structure, we discovered a locked metal cabinet. Brent jimmied it open with a crowbar. Inside were a few MRE packets, some dusty medical supplies, and a sealed container labeled water purification tablets. My spirits lifted. "Jackpot," Brent whispered, stuffing them into his pack. We also found a partially crushed cardboard box of flares. We took what was intact, 4 flares total. You never knew when you might need to signal or create a distraction. Our luck was short-lived. The moment we stepped outside, a guttural snarl froze us in place. A figure in tattered clothing stumbled around the side of the building, arms twitching, eyes glassy and unfocused. An infected human just a few yards away. The infected person locked onto us almost instantly, letting out a low, rasping moan. Another figure appeared behind it, similarly disheveled, moving with unsteady haste. My pulse thundered. We had no time for quiet evasion. "Go!" Brent hissed, raising his rifle. A shot rang out, echoing through the deserted checkpoint. The first infected staggered back, falling to the pavement. The second let out a snarling wail and charged. I squeezed the trigger, my ears ringing from the gunfire. My shot found its mark and the figure collapsed. We wasted no time lingering, more could be nearby. We sprinted back towards truck, hearts pounding, expecting at any moment to see infected swarming from the derelict cars. Ward had already started the engine, eyes wide with alarm. He slammed the gas as soon as we dove inside, sending the truck barreling down the torn-up highway. Behind us, the checkpoint shrank into the distance. Our adrenaline spiked, hands shaking from the close call. We'd avoided major highways for a reason, and this confirmed our fears. Still, we'd salvaged some vital supplies. I tried to steady my nerves, reminding myself that surviving these encounters was part of our new reality. We continued north, but tension simmered. The gunshots attracted attention. Twice we had to outrun small groups of infected who appeared on side roads. Ward began voicing doubts about pressing on, claiming it might be better to find a secluded area and fortify, similar to how I'd originally tried at the cabin. Brent disagreed. "We've come this far. We can't just give up on finding that camp or some functioning authority. The radio broadcast proves there's something out there." Ward scoffed. "Or it's a trap. Look, I don't trust half-baked rumors." The argument escalated over the next day of travel, with no immediate resolution. In truth, I saw both sides. If there was a real quarantine camp, it could provide safety and resources, but maybe it was only a fleeting leftover signal from the past. Ultimately, we decided to push on a little farther until the truck's fuel supply ran out. If we didn't find a sign of a real camp by then, we'd reconsider. Late one afternoon, the truck's engine began sputtering. Our fuel supply was nearly gone. Ward guided the vehicle onto a side road that led through an overgrown meadow. The setting sun cast a warm glow across the horizon, giving everything an oddly serene look. Suddenly, the ground beneath the front wheels gave way slightly, the truck lurching forward. A shallow ditch had eroded beneath the grass. We all lurched in our seats. With a groan of metal, the truck sank further. The right front tire stuck. "Hold on," Ward barked, wrestling with the steering wheel. The engine coughed, then died. We climbed out, scanning the area. A small wooden sign at the edge of the meadow read, "Hidden Creek Wildlife Reserve." The old roads here must have collapsed from neglect. We tried pushing the truck out, but without enough power or a working engine, it barely budged. The fuel gauge read nearly empty. Even if we freed it, we'd only go another mile or two. "This might be it," Ward said with a resigned shrug. "End of the line." Brent sighed, looking around. "Well, we might find a trail that leads out of here." The three of us gathered supplies from the truck. Sleeping bags, the MRE packets, water purification tablets, everything we could carry, and packed it onto our backs. Though we'd traveled many miles in that old pickup, its final resting place was here in a forgotten meadow. We set off on foot once more, guided by a hand-drawn map Ward possessed, which highlighted a potential northbound trail on the reserve's outskirts. The day's last light was fading fast, so we hurried to find some form of shelter before dark. The trail was barely discernible, overrun by weeds and bushes. Occasional wooden markers jutted from the ground, their paint peeled. If we followed them correctly, the path should lead us closer to an old nature lodge or campsite. As twilight deepened, we heard the distant sound of rushing water. Rounding a bend, we glimpsed a narrow creek cutting through a rocky channel. A broken footbridge spanned it, half collapsed. We were contemplating whether to cross when Ward suddenly tensed, aiming his rifle upstream. "Did you see that?" he hissed. Brent and I strained to see. The shadows cast by the overhanging trees were thick, but I thought I caught a glimpse of a movement, something low to the ground. A moment later, a guttural snarl echoed off the rocks and a shape darted out of view. My heart clenched. Could be an infected animal or a stray dog. We didn't want to risk a confrontation in the dark. Carefully, we inched back toward a cluster of boulders that offered partial shelter. Ward set up a perimeter, laying tripwires with the leftover cord from his pack. Meanwhile, Brent and I gathered stones to block any direct approach. We settled in for a tense night. None of us slept well. A few times we heard that same snarling, accompanied by the crunch of gravel. Whatever it was seemed to circle our camp, but never showed itself fully. By dawn, we were exhausted. Yet we forced ourselves to break camp and press on. The path continued along the creek, leading deeper into the wildlife reserve. Eventually, we rounded a bend and saw what looked like an old park information center, nestled among tall pines. The building appeared modest, a single-story structure with a wide porch. An old sign read, "Welcome to Hidden Creek Lodge," in faded lettering. My hopes lifted. A lodge might have more robust shelters, perhaps even a generator. As we approached, we caught movement inside. Ward braced his rifle and Brent followed suit. I called out, "We're survivors, not infected." A face peered through a dusty window, a young woman, eyes wide. A voice came back, trembling yet firm. "You'd better not be lying. No sudden moves." She stepped outside a moment later, crossbow in hand. Two more figures emerged behind her. One older, wearing a camouflage jacket, another with an arm in a sling. They looked at us warily, but not overtly hostile. "We're just passing through," I said, hands raised. "We have no intention of causing trouble." The older man sized us up. "Where are you headed?" Brent motioned vaguely north. "Rumors of a camp, or any place that's safer than farmland." A flicker of recognition crossed the woman's face. We've heard something about that too. A radio broadcast a few days back. We exchanged cautious looks. Could we trust them? Yet they seemed as wary of us as we were of them, which was somehow reassuring. They invited us inside, though all of us remained on guard. The lodge's interior was more organized than I had expected. Sleeping cots were arranged along one wall, and a makeshift kitchen area housed bottled water, non-perishable food, and a small gas stove. I saw a portable generator in the corner, though it didn't appear to be running. Introductions were brief. The young woman's name was Kara, the older man was Todd, and the one with the sling was Nolan. They'd stumbled upon the lodge while fleeing infected, much like us. Their supplies were limited but carefully rationed. We spent the next hour sharing stories. Each group had narrowly escaped infected animals or people. We described the cabin, the ranger station, the abandoned farms. They detailed how a small group of survivors had attempted to fortify this lodge, only to see half their number vanish one night during a violent raid by infected. Since then, they'd been too afraid to stray far. They also confirmed the partial radio signal we'd picked up. Kara had been scanning frequencies daily, and once caught a voice repeating coordinates, urging survivors to seek final quarantine zone north of a certain latitude. She didn't catch the full details, but it was more confirmation that something might be up there. "So you plan on heading that way?" Todd asked, leaning against a counter. Ward shrugged. "I'm not convinced it's real, but yeah, that's the plan." The lodge group exchanged glances. Kara bit her lip, as though wrestling with a decision. "We talked about it, but we're not sure we can survive the trip. Nolan can hardly walk," she said, gesturing to his injured leg. "Todd's in no shape for a long journey either." We fell silent. The suggestion was obvious. If we all teamed up, there'd be more hands to help. But we'd also have more mouths to feed, and more risk of being spotted by infected. After a tense discussion, we decided on a compromise. Brent and I, along with Ward, would scout the northern trails beyond the lodge to see if the route was passable or if there were infected hordes. If it seemed feasible, we'd come back, and Todd and Kara would attempt the trip with us, possibly bringing Nolan along in a makeshift cart or stretcher. That night, the lodge provided welcome respite. We took turns on watch, but the presence of others felt strangely comforting, like a glimmer of civilization in a broken world. The building was sturdy, with locked doors and windows boarded against threats. Still, none of us forgot the creeping danger outside. Early the next day, Ward, Brent and I set out to scout the trails. Kara gave us a rough hand-drawn map of the reserve's northern edge, where she thought an old service road led out. The forest was dense, full of pine and birch. Birdsong was scarce, replaced by the sound of wind through branches. We hiked steadily, checking for any sign of large infected groups. After an hour, we came across footprints in the soft earth, at least 4 or 5 distinct sets, possibly more. They looked relatively fresh, leading west. We moved cautiously. The next discovery was more concerning. A half-eaten deer carcass near the trail. It bore signs of violent feeding, and the deer's eyes were clouded. The infection could have been the cause of its death, or perhaps it was partially infected and then devoured by something else. Brent grimaced, turning away. An uneasy sense of déjà vu washed over me, recalling the odd tracks and diseased wildlife near my old cabin. We pressed forward, hoping not to encounter whatever caused this. Eventually we reached a crest where the forest thinned. The service road Kara mentioned curved into the distance, pitted with potholes and lined by tall grass. We saw no immediate threats, though a single cabin was visible down the slope, shutters drawn. We had just decided to turn back and report to Kara and Todd when Ward stopped abruptly. "Listen." A faint droning sound approached from above, steadily growing louder. A plane, a helicopter. We looked at each other, hearts pounding. It was definitely an aircraft, engines echoing across the valley. Sure enough, a small helicopter soared overhead, low enough for us to see its shape clearly. We waved frantically, but there was no indication the pilot noticed us. The chopper flew northwest, disappearing over the tree line. When the noise faded, we were left with renewed hope. "Someone's still flying," Brent breathed. "Could be military or rescue." If there were air patrols, maybe the rumored camp or quarantine zone truly existed. We had to get moving. We hurried back to the lodge, adrenaline fueling our steps. The trip felt shorter, as though excitement propelled us. Upon arrival, we found Kara and Todd anxiously waiting. They relaxed when they saw us, relief evident on their faces. We relayed everything: the footprints, the deer carcass, and the helicopter. A spark of hope lit Kara's eyes. "That means we're not alone," she said. Todd nodded. "All right, we'll try the trek north, but Nolan's leg is bad. We'll have to improvise a stretcher and move slowly." For the next couple of days, we prepared. Brent helped Todd build a sturdy cart from lodge materials. Kara inventoried their supplies, combining them with ours. Ward fashioned extra defensive gear from scraps, shields made of plywood, and metal scraps that might protect us if we encountered infected. That final night in the lodge, tension mixed with excitement. We were about to embark on a risky journey, but at least we had direction. If the helicopter patrols flew regularly, maybe we could signal them. At dawn, we set off. 6 survivors, 2 improvised carts, and a faint glimmer of determination. The trail we scouted was manageable, though progress was slow with Nolan's injury. We all took turns hauling the cart, watchful of every rustle in the brush. As we moved further from the lodge, the sense of finality weighed on us. This was a point of no return. Traveling with injured companions meant we couldn't quickly run back. We had to forge ahead, hoping to find some semblance of safety before we ran out of supplies or stamina. Our plan was to reach the service road by nightfall, set up a secure camp, then follow the route further north. If we were lucky, the helicopter might pass overhead again, giving us a chance to signal. If not, we'd continue until we found signs of the rumored quarantine zone or any functioning outpost. Every crunch of gravel, every distant moan, every shift in the undergrowth sent pulses of anxiety through the group. Yet, for the first time in a while, I felt the power of shared purpose, an actual band of survivors, each contributing to keep the group going. We have no illusions that our journey will be easy. Infected wildlife, possible roadblocks, or human threats could lurk around any bend. Nolan's injury slows our pace, but leaving him behind was never an option. We don't even know if the quarantine zone truly exists, or if the helicopter was a sign that a real haven lies ahead. Still, as we push onward, the morning sun crests the hills, illuminating the winding path before us. The pine-scented wind carries a gentle whisper of possibility. In this world turned upside down, holding on to hope is our greatest form of survival. We continue, step by weary step, forging into the unknown. Maybe we'll find a refuge, maybe we won't. But one truth remains. We're doing more than hiding now. We're searching. And for us, that's enough to keep going. If you're out there reading or hearing about our story, remember to keep your eyes open for every small sign of life, be it a faint broadcast, a distant helicopter, or the solidarity of fellow survivors. The infection may have taken our homes, our comforts, and so many lives. But as long as we walk forward, hope remains on the horizon. Thank you for listening. If this story sent shivers down your spine, don't forget to like and subscribe for more unsettling creepypastas. Your support keeps this channel alive. Until next time, stay vigilant and remember, curiosity can be quite the companion, and sometimes a curse.